I still remember the day everything changed. It was a bright morning, and we were supposed to celebrate two major milestones. Teresa, my stepdaughter, had been accepted into college, and Paul, my husband, had just been promoted at work. We had planned a family celebration that evening, something I thought would bring us closer after years of tension. But when I came home that afternoon, the sight that greeted me shattered any illusion of normalcy I'd been clinging to. Garbage bags. They were piled up in our front yard, filled with my clothes and books, some spilling out and scattered across the lawn. At first, I thought it must be a mistake. Maybe someone had gone through the wrong bags. But as I moved closer, my heart sank. These weren't just random bags of trash, they were my things. I rushed inside, my pulse quickening with each step, hoping to find some explanation. But what I saw upstairs turned my stomach. There, in the middle of the bedroom, stood Paul, Teresa, and my mother-in-law, cheerfully throwing the rest of my belongings into more garbage bags. They barely acknowledged me when I burst in. "Hurry up and leave," Teresa said, her voice flat but with a hint of smugness. "Grandma can't move in until you're gone." "Exactly," Paul added without looking up, his voice casual as if he were commenting on the weather. "We don't need a failure like you around." My mother-in-law, who had never liked me, laughed softly. "Thanks for the college money, though. We'll take that." I stood frozen, disbelief gripping me like a vice. Paul's face was emotionless, Teresa's filled with disdain. And my mother-in-law, she'd never hidden her contempt. But this was a new level of cruelty. It was as if I wasn't a person to them, just an inconvenience they were finally rid of. When Paul laughed, the sound broke something inside me. "You, earning $10 an hour, really thought you'd be worth something? You're nothing. Get out." I felt a chill run through me. Something inside me snapped, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel fear. I felt anger. No, not just anger, resolve. "I'll leave," I said, my voice steady, even though everything inside me was trembling. I turned and walked out. I gathered the bags from the yard, stuffed them into my car, and drove away. As I drove, tears blurred my vision, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I wouldn't let them see me break. I wouldn't let this be the end. It wasn't supposed to turn out like this. 12 years ago, when I first met Paul, he had been nothing but kind. We'd met through work, and his cheerful, outgoing nature drew me to him. He seemed like everything I wasn't: confident, happy, and full of life. At the time, I was an introvert, shy and uncertain about my future. He made me feel like I was someone special, someone who could be loved. We dated for a year before he proposed. I was flustered. I had never seen myself as the kind of woman someone would want to marry. I wasn't glamorous or outgoing. I was simple. But Paul made me feel cherished. He introduced me to his 9-year-old daughter, Teresa, who seemed sweet and shy, just like I had been at her age. We got along well, or so I thought. Everything seemed perfect. Our wedding was modest, just close friends and family. I thought I was stepping into a new life, a new beginning with Paul and Teresa. But it didn't take long for the cracks to show. At first, it was small things. Paul's mother would visit, and though she seemed polite at first, her true nature soon came out. "Kelly, there's dust on the shelf," she'd say, inspecting every corner of the house. "Don't you clean properly?" I smiled, trying to be the perfect daughter-in-law. I would brush off her comments and work harder to please her. But nothing was ever good enough. Paul began to change too, though at first I didn't notice it. He would make comments about my cooking or the state of the house, always comparing me to his mother, who had been a full-time homemaker. "You only work part-time," Paul said one night, his tone sharp. "Shouldn't you have more time to make proper meals? My mother never used store-bought food." I wanted to explain that balancing work and house chores wasn't easy, but I didn't. I just nodded, trying harder to prepare meals from scratch, staying up late at night to finish everything. I thought if I just worked a little harder, things would go back to how they were. I was wrong. As the years passed, Paul's treatment worsened, and Teresa, once sweet, became more like him. She started imitating his words, his tone. When she reached her teenage years, she stopped calling me Kelly and began referring to me as the old lady. It was a punch to the gut every time I heard it. But I kept telling myself that it was just a phase, that maybe when she went off to college, things would improve. I convinced myself that deep down, Teresa was still that sweet little girl I had met. But the reality was that they had both changed. Component placement. Or maybe they had always been like this, and I was just too blind to see it. Paul's verbal abuse grew harsher with every passing day. "I come home tired and this is what I get," he'd say, throwing his lunchbox on the counter. "Frozen food and leftovers. Do you even care about me?" It didn't matter how many times I tried to explain that preparing fresh meals every day was exhausting. It didn't matter that I stayed up late just to make sure everything was perfect. Nothing I did was enough. And Teresa, once again following her father's lead, would chime in. "She's right, Dad. You should be grateful. We're even eating her food at all," Teresa would say, crossing her arms. I bit my tongue every time, swallowing my anger. I thought if I could just hold on a little longer, things would change. Teresa's college acceptance would be the turning point, I told myself. Once she was gone, Paul would be more reasonable, and maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to how things were. That hope was shattered the day I found my belongings thrown out like garbage. The moment I left the house, I knew there was no going back. But as I drove, something inside me shifted. I wasn't the timid woman they had taken advantage of anymore. I was done. I pulled over at a gas station and called my uncle. He had always been supportive of me, even after my parents passed away when I was younger. He had raised me like his own and helped me get on my feet after college. When I told him what had happened, he was furious. "You can stay in one of our dorms until you get back on your feet," he said, not hesitating for a second. I accepted his offer, thankful to have someone who cared. That night, I moved into a small, quiet room in the dorm, away from the chaos of my old life. I spent the next few days gathering my thoughts, drying the clothes that had been soaked in the rain and figuring out my next steps. I had never lived alone before, but somehow, in that moment, it felt liberating. I wasn't sad about losing Paul or Teresa anymore. I was angry, yes, but I was more determined than ever to take control of my life. They had taken so much from me, my time, my energy, my self-worth. But they wouldn't take anything more. Not now. Not ever again. A month passed quietly, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace. I focused on myself for the first time in what felt like forever. I started writing again, a hobby I had long abandoned during my marriage. It was a small joy, but it reminded me of who I used to be before I became Paul's wife, before I became Teresa's stepmother. Then out of the blue, Paul called. I didn't answer at first. I let it go to voicemail, figuring he was calling to demand something or to hurl more insults my way, but the messages that followed were different. "Kelly, please, pick up the phone." His voice was strained, almost desperate. "Something's wrong. Teresa's college enrollment has been canceled." I smiled as I listened to the voicemail. Of course, it had been canceled. I canceled it. I had withdrawn all the tuition money from the account and moved it into one under my name. Teresa wasn't going to college, not with the money I had saved. When I finally picked up Paul's call, he was beside himself. "You had no right. That money was for Teresa. She worked hard to get into that school." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Did she? Because from what I remember, Teresa spent most of her time partying, not studying. College was just another excuse for her to spend money. Paul was furious. "You're petty. You're doing this out of spite." "No, Paul," I replied calmly. "I'm doing this because you and Teresa used me. You took advantage of my kindness, my patience, and my money. But it ends now." He hung up, but the calls didn't stop. He kept calling, kept leaving messages, begging me to return the money, telling me that without it, Teresa couldn't enroll in another college. But I didn't care. They had taken enough from me. Teresa would have to figure out her own future, and Paul would have to live with the consequences of his actions. A few weeks later, I received another call. This time, Paul sounded more frantic than ever. "My promotion's been canceled," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been demoted." I wasn't surprised. My uncle, who owned a large company that worked closely with Paul's employer, had pulled some strings. He had found out about how Paul had treated me and decided to cut ties with his company unless they demoted Paul. It wasn't revenge exactly. It was justice. "Maybe you should have treated me better," I said coldly. Paul begged me to talk to my uncle to convince him to change his mind, but I refused. He had brought this on himself. In the months that followed, I rebuilt my life piece by piece. I filed for divorce and took back the money that was rightfully mine. Paul and Teresa tried to fight it, but they didn't stand a chance. I had evidence of the years of verbal abuse, of the way they had used me, and of Paul's financial manipulation. In the end, they owed me compensation, and I made sure they paid every cent. One day, long after the dust had settled, I received another call from Paul. This time, his voice was quiet, defeated. "They're making us move out of the house," he said. "It's your house, after all." I had almost forgotten. The house we had lived in, the one I had been kicked out of, was in my name. It had been a gift from my uncle when Paul and I first got married. Paul hadn't realized, but now he had no choice but to leave. As I hung up the phone, I smiled for the first time in a long time. I had won,